10 years ago, Lucas Carter pulled Amelia Grace from a sinking car at the bottom of a lake, then vanished before she ever opened her eyes. Now he is a single father working as a maintenance technician inside the billion-dollar company that bears her name. When Amelia is betrayed, stripped of her power, and left with no one standing beside her, Lucas saves her life a second time. In the dark of a borrowed house, she notices the scar across his palm and asks him, voice-breaking, why he keeps helping her. Lucas says nothing for a long time, because the answer could destroy them both. Stay until the end to learn the secret Lucas traded his entire future to keep hidden. The morning began the way most important mornings at Grace Mobility began, with too many people moving too quickly through hallways that smelled like fresh coffee and expensive ambition. Amelia Grace was preparing to unveil Apex One, the self-driving prototype meant to decide whether her company would lead the next decade of transportation or quietly disappear into it. Reporters filled the lobby, investors filled the boardrooms, and members of the board circled the executive floor like they already sensed blood in the water. Down in the testing bay, far from the cameras and the champagne glasses, a man in a plain gray technician's uniform checked cable connections nobody else bothered to check. Lucas Carter was invisible to almost everyone in that building, noticed only when something broke and someone needed it fixed quietly and quickly. A young engineer told him the brake sensors had already been certified and that his input was not required, the kind of dismissal Lucas had grown used to receiving in rooms full of people younger and less experienced than he was. He nodded, said nothing, and kept working, because he had learned long ago that arguing rarely changed anything in buildings built on hierarchy. What he noticed, instead, was a response delay so small most people would never catch it, a lag of only a few thousandths of a second in the feedback signal from the braking system. He opened the system log on a battered laptop that had seen better years and found a strange piece of code quietly erasing its own footprint after every diagnostic pass. He reported it to his supervisor, who reminded him, not unkindly, that maintenance technicians did not have clearance to question systems engineers. Amelia walked past the testing bay a few minutes later, trailed by assistants reciting schedules and talking points, and she did not recognize the man kneeling beside the prototype's open panel. But something made her slow her steps anyway, her eyes catching on the long scar across his right palm before she even understood why it mattered. For half a second, a fragment surfaced in her mind, cold water pressing against her chest, shattered glass, a bleeding hand pulling her upward through darkness. She blinked it away, telling herself it was simply an old trauma resurfacing at a stressful moment, and continued toward the private elevator without looking back. Lucas watched her disappear behind the closing doors, and something in his expression suggested he had recognized her long before that morning, perhaps every single day for years. Before the sun set, Lucas had already traced the strange code back to an authorization signed by Joseph Wyatt, the company's vice chairman and chief financial officer. Instead of reporting it up a chain that had ignored him all day, he quietly copied the data onto a private drive he kept hidden in his bag, the way a man does when he has learned, through painful experience, exactly how little his voice counts inside a company like this one. That evening, Lucas returned to the modest house he shared with his daughter on the outskirts of Seattle, a home that told the story of a disciplined, careful life lived without excess. Bills sat neatly stacked on the kitchen table beside a small collection of tools and, tucked in the corner, an old locked metal box that had not been opened in longer than anyone would guess. A short phone call from his daughter Madison, staying that night with relatives, filled the room briefly with the ordinary warmth of a father checking in, asking about homework, promising to see her soon. After the call ended, Lucas sat alone at the table and finally opened the metal box, the hinges protesting from years of disuse. Inside were fragments of a life he had buried rather than lived, an old Grace Mobility employee badge, a shard of car glass stained with rust, a hand-drawn schematic of an early-generation braking system, and a yellowed newspaper clipping describing a miraculous survival at a lake 10 years earlier. Beneath those objects lay a signed non-disclosure agreement bearing his own signature, the ink long since faded but the weight of it undiminished. The memories rose slowly, pulling him back to a version of himself who was 25 years old, freshly widowed, and raising an infant daughter completely alone while working as a promising young test engineer for this same company. Back then, Lucas had discovered that the experimental vehicle he was testing could have its braking system remotely disabled, a flaw serious enough to kill someone if it was ever exploited. He had sent his warning up the chain exactly as protocol demanded, only to be told to wait patiently for an internal investigation that never seemed to move with any urgency. That same night, he learned that Amelia had taken the very prototype in question to drive herself to a charity event near a lake outside the city, unaware of the danger sitting quietly inside the vehicle's controls. Lucas had chased her through pouring rain, desperate to catch up and warn her before it was too late. But before he could reach her, the car lost control, tore through a guardrail, and plunged into the black water below. Without a moment's hesitation, Lucas dove in after her, smashing the window with his bare hand, cutting through the seatbelt, and dragging her unconscious body back to the surface through freezing water that determined to keep both of them beneath it. As sirens grew louder in the distance, he received a threatening phone call warning him that if he ever spoke publicly about the system failure, he would instead be charged with sabotaging the vehicle himself. Terrified for his daughter's future and unwilling to risk losing custody of her, Lucas disappeared into the trees before the ambulance arrived, leaving Amelia to wake up not knowing the name or the face of the man who had saved her life. In the present, as he closed the metal box and set it aside, Lucas received a single anonymous message glowing on his phone screen. 10 years ago you stayed silent. This time you should do the same. The following morning, Lucas requested a meeting with Amelia to warn her about the upcoming Apex One demonstration, a request her assistant flatly denied since he held no appointment and no standing to make one. Left with no other option, Lucas positioned himself in the hallway outside the boardroom and stopped her directly as she walked toward the cameras waiting downstairs. He told her plainly that the vehicle's control system had been compromised and that it was not safe to proceed with the public demonstration scheduled for that afternoon. Amelia bristled at his sudden, unauthorized approach, yet something steady in his voice made her hesitate longer than she intended to. Joseph appeared behind her almost instantly, immediately working to diminish Lucas in front of everyone gathered in the hallway. He reminded the room that Lucas was merely a maintenance technician, insisted the system logs showed nothing unusual, and suggested, with practiced smoothness, that the man was simply seeking attention before a high-profile event. He then produced records claiming Lucas had been terminated from Grace Mobility a decade earlier for violating safety protocols, records designed to erase any credibility Lucas might have carried into that hallway. Amelia turned to him and asked with genuine confusion why a man once fired from her company would ever choose to return and work for it again. Bound by the confidentiality agreement he could never explain, Lucas answered only that he needed the work and understood these systems better than most people realized. Pressure from the board, magnified by a demonstration already streaming live to investors around the world, pushed Amelia to proceed despite her lingering unease, though she insisted on one final safety check before the vehicle moved. While technicians ran their last diagnostics, Lucas found a way to slip near the prototype and secretly install a small mechanical kill switch of his own design, hoping he would never need to use it. Moments into the demonstration, Apex One suddenly accelerated without warning, surging directly toward the crowd of onlookers gathered behind reinforced glass. The electronic braking system failed to respond at all, its digital signals apparently overridden by something far more powerful than a technician's clearance level. Lucas sprinted forward, tore open a maintenance panel along the track, and triggered the mechanical override he had installed only minutes earlier. The vehicle screeched to a stop mere feet from the observation glass, close enough that several investors stumbled backward in genuine terror. Amid the chaos and shouting, Joseph moved quickly to declare, loudly and publicly, that Lucas's unauthorized interference was the true cause of the near disaster. Security located the small device Lucas had installed inside the vehicle's wiring, and within the hour, Amelia found herself signing a suspension order against the very man who had just saved her life for the second time. Lucas was escorted from the testing facility in full view of employees who had never once noticed him before that day, his composure unbroken even as guards gripped his arms. He asked only one thing as he was led away: that the technical team preserve the raw data from the 3 minutes leading up to the malfunction. Joseph immediately ordered that same data wiped, citing standard security protocol, a decision that struck Amelia as strange the moment she heard it. If Lucas truly wanted to sabotage the vehicle, she wondered privately, why would he be the one demanding the evidence be saved rather than destroyed? Ella Jackson, Amelia's legal counsel and one of the few people whose loyalty had never wavered, discovered that the deletion order had actually been issued seconds before the malfunction even occurred, not after it. Joseph brushed the discrepancy aside as routine automated memory clearing, a minor technical detail unworthy of further attention. Before Lucas left the building entirely, Amelia pulled him into a private room and demanded answers to questions that had been building inside her for hours. She asked why a maintenance technician understood Apex One's architecture better than its own development team, why he had known the location of an unpublished emergency shutoff, and why his 10-year-old employment file contained pages that had clearly been sealed. Lucas answered only that not everyone she trusted actually wanted her project to succeed, an answer that felt both true and maddeningly incomplete. Amelia's patience finally broke, convinced he was manipulating her with half-truths designed to serve some hidden purpose she could not yet see. Lucas studied her for a long moment before speaking again, his voice quiet but unwavering. "There are truths that do not save the person who hears them," he told her. "They only take away everything that person once believed in." Amelia insisted the choice of what to believe belonged to her alone, and for a moment it seemed Lucas might finally tell her everything. Instead, he caught sight of Joseph watching them through the glass wall outside the office and stopped himself, choosing silence once again. He left the building carrying the copied data with him. While inside, Joseph advised Amelia to hand the entire investigation over to his office for safekeeping. By evening, news networks were already broadcasting stories, suggesting the CEO of Grace Mobility had nearly caused a public disaster through reckless mismanagement, and the company's stock began falling as the board scheduled an emergency session for the following morning. Deep inside the data, Ella uncovered something that unsettled her far more than anything Joseph had said, a discovery that Lucas's small device had never been capable of accelerating the vehicle at all. Its only function, as far as she could determine, was to stop the car the moment its control system was seized by someone else entirely. Joseph used the unfolding crisis to convince the board that Amelia had knowingly concealed technical risk from investors and the public alike. He presented carefully altered reports suggesting she had dismissed internal safety warnings on more than one occasion, reports crafted to look damning under the glare of a single bad morning. David Mason, chairman of the board and a man who valued shareholder confidence above almost everything else, proposed temporarily suspending Amelia while an independent investigation ran its course. Amelia argued fiercely against the motion, but without proof that the data had been manipulated, she had nothing solid enough to stop the vote from passing. Within hours, interim control of the company shifted entirely into Joseph's hands, and the transformation of Amelia's world happened with brutal efficiency. Her building access card was deactivated before lunch, her corporate accounts were frozen by early afternoon, and colleagues who once greeted her warmly now found excuses to avoid eye contact entirely. Reporters crowded the entrance of company headquarters while nervous investors publicly called for her resignation, their statements circulating faster than she could respond to any of them. Joseph met with her privately that evening, offering what looked like sympathy while quietly suggesting she sell her shares to protect what he called her father's legacy. It became painfully clear to Amelia that Joseph wanted far more than her removal from the chief executive position. He wanted total control of the empire her family had built from nothing. She tried calling Ella for help, but the call dropped suddenly, and her phone began showing unmistakable signs that someone was monitoring it in real time. As she left the underground parking structure that night, her car's locking system engaged on its own, sealing her inside a vehicle that began venting exhaust into its enclosed compartment. Lucas arrived within minutes, having noticed the strange signal the moment it appeared through the copied data he still carried. He shattered the passenger window, pulled Amelia to safety, and got her into his own aging car before Joseph's security detail could arrive at the scene. Amelia sat shaking beside him, furious and utterly confused about why a man she had just suspended would risk everything to save her life again. Lucas told her plainly that she could not return home, could not check into a hotel, and could not go anywhere connected in any way to the company that now belonged, at least for the moment, to someone else. With no other option left, and no one else she could trust, Amelia agreed to go with him into the darkness of the unfamiliar night. As the car pulled away from the city lights, Amelia noticed a bag Lucas had prepared in advance, containing documents, cash, and an untraceable phone, arranged with the kind of precision that suggested he had known this attack was coming long before it happened. Lucas drove her to an old wooden cabin outside Seattle, a place he had once lived years earlier, modest in appearance but equipped with its own independent power supply and completely disconnected from any network. Amelia noticed almost immediately that the cabin was already stocked with a first aid kit, an offline computer, printed maps of Grace Mobility's infrastructure, spare parts from several generations of company vehicles, and old files describing an accident from a decade earlier. A quiet suspicion began forming in her mind that Lucas might be involved in something far deeper than she had first imagined. He connected the copied data from Apex One and showed her clear evidence that the vehicle had received its acceleration command from an internal server under Joseph's control. That evidence alone was not enough, since it existed only as an unverified copy rather than something a court could rely upon, and the original recording remained locked inside the company's old physical archive. As Lucas changed the bandage on his injured hand, cut earlier while breaking through the car window, Amelia caught full sight of the long scar running across his palm. The memory returned to her fully this time, unmistakable and undeniable, the exact hand that had shattered glass beneath the lake 10 years before. She asked him directly whether they had met before that night, and his refusal to answer only deepened her growing certainty that he was hiding something enormous. "Are you the person who sabotaged that car?" she finally asked him, her voice trembling with a mixture of hope and dread, "or are you the one who pulled me out?" Lucas admitted, at last, that he was indeed the man who had pulled her from the sinking car at the lake, disappearing before she ever regained consciousness. He walked her through everything that had happened that night, discovering the vulnerability in the vehicle's remote control system, sending his warning up the chain, being told to wait, and then chasing her car through the storm once he learned she was driving it. He described diving into the frigid water, cutting her free, carrying her to the shore, and slipping away into the trees the instant he heard sirens approaching. Amelia felt gratitude and rage colliding inside her at once, unable to understand why he had let her spend 10 years searching for a stranger she could never quite remember. Lucas produced the original non-disclosure agreement, signed a decade earlier by her father Jackson Grace, and laid it on the table between them. Under its terms, Lucas had agreed to accept blame for a supposed safety violation, remain permanently silent about the true system failure, avoid prosecution for alleged sabotage, and allow his employment records to be sealed forever. Amelia assumed at first that her father had done this purely to protect the company's reputation, but Lucas told her gently that this was not the whole story. In the aftermath of the accident, Joseph had fabricated evidence suggesting Lucas himself had tampered with the vehicle, evidence convincing enough to persuade the police of his guilt. Jackson Grace had known the truth, that Lucas was innocent, yet forced him to sign the agreement anyway because the company stood on the edge of financial collapse at the time. Thousands of employees could have lost their jobs if the safety failure had been made public immediately, a burden Jackson was unwilling to place on his workforce. Lucas, a widowed father raising an infant daughter completely alone, understood that a criminal charge could cost him custody of the only family he had left. He chose silence to protect his daughter and to give Jackson time to quietly repair the flawed system before anyone else got hurt. Jackson had promised, in return, that he would reveal the full truth once the company stabilized, a promise that never came to pass. He died several years later, and control of the damaging records passed entirely into Joseph's hands, where they remained buried ever since. Amelia broke down in tears, finally understanding that the fortune she inherited had been quietly protected by the sacrifice of a stranger who owed her family nothing at all. Lucas told her he had not helped her out of loyalty to the Grace name or any desire for money. He had helped her because she was not responsible for her father's mistakes, and because he refused to let her die inside the same conspiracy that had already stolen 10 years of his own life. Lucas then revealed one final detail, that Jackson had left behind a recorded confession before his death, but it remained locked inside the physical data archive beneath company headquarters, a space now firmly under Joseph's control. Amelia wanted to expose Lucas's story to the public immediately, but Ella warned her that his testimony alone would never be enough to defeat a man as careful as Joseph. They needed 3 separate pieces of proof: the original Apex One data, the decade-old records documenting the system vulnerability, and Jackson's recorded confession. Ella reached Amelia through a secure encrypted channel and confirmed that Joseph planned to hold an emergency shareholder meeting the very next morning to approve selling the company's core technology division to a shell corporation. Lucas realized instantly that Joseph intended to strip the company of its patents entirely and let Grace Mobility collapse once the technology had already been transferred elsewhere. Despite Lucas's objections, Amelia insisted on returning to headquarters that night, arguing that this was still her company and that she needed to face the truth herself rather than hide from it any longer. They entered through an old maintenance corridor Lucas had designed a decade earlier, a route hidden from every modern security upgrade the building had since received. Moving through the technical underlevels of her own company, Amelia saw parts of the building she had never once visited despite spending years running it from the top floor. She began to understand, in a way she never had before, that Lucas had spent nearly a decade living inside the invisible corners of the very empire that carried her family's name. When they finally reached the data archive, Lucas discovered that Joseph had already moved the physical files into the primary server room for safekeeping. The building's security system detected their presence almost immediately, triggering fire doors that began sealing shut throughout the lower levels and separating them from Ella entirely. Lucas guided Amelia toward the physical storage vault, where they eventually located Jackson's original hard drive among rows of aging equipment. Before they could finish copying its contents, Joseph arrived with a full security detail, calm and entirely unsurprised to find them there. He admitted openly that he had expected Lucas to return eventually, remarking that people burdened by conscience are always the easiest to predict. Then, with a small, cruel smile, he played an audio recording that had clearly been edited and rearranged, one in which Jackson Grace appeared to confirm that Lucas himself had sabotaged the vehicle all those years ago. Joseph told Amelia she would surrender the hard drive immediately if she wanted any hope of keeping Lucas out of prison. He revealed that the police already held evidence suggesting Lucas had sabotaged Apex One, kidnapped Amelia from the parking garage, illegally accessed secure systems, and stolen confidential company data. He tried to drive a wedge between them by suggesting Lucas had only rescued her out of some twisted desire for revenge against the Grace family. Amelia looked at Lucas, and this time, unlike before, she did not waver for even a moment. She reminded Joseph in front of everyone present that a man seeking revenge would have simply let her die inside that sealed parking garage rather than risk his own life to save her. Furious, Joseph ordered his security team to arrest Lucas on the spot, and Lucas allowed himself to be restrained so that Amelia could slip toward a side exit with the hard drive still in hand. But Amelia refused to leave without him, choosing instead to activate the building's internal broadcast system using her emergency executive access code. Within seconds, the entire confrontation began streaming directly into the boardroom and onto the company's backup servers, visible to everyone who mattered. Realizing he was being recorded live, Joseph lunged toward the broadcast equipment in a desperate attempt to destroy it before anyone else could witness what was happening. Lucas intervened just enough to stop him, keeping the confrontation focused on evidence and locked doors, rather than allowing it to spiral into needless violence. Moments later, Ella arrived with David Mason and a team of independent auditors trailing close behind her. It turned out Ella had already convinced David to monitor the situation after proving beyond doubt that Joseph had falsified the company's financial reports for years. Joseph continued insisting that Jackson's recording proved Lucas's guilt beyond question, refusing to back down even as the room filled with people who no longer believed him. Lucas noticed that the file playing aloud was only the opening fragment of a much longer recording, the rest of which remained hidden inside an encrypted partition. The password appeared to be the exact date of the accident, yet the system demanded an additional phrase to unlock it fully. Amelia suddenly remembered the final words her father had spoken to her before he died, words that had never made sense until this very moment. There are debts, he had told her once, that cannot be repaid with money. The phrase unlocked the hidden partition instantly. The full recording began to play, and Jackson Grace's voice filled the room, reaching every member of the board who had gathered to watch. In the recording, Jackson admitted that Lucas had discovered the system vulnerability well before the original accident ever occurred. He confirmed that Joseph had secretly exploited that same vulnerability to seize control of the vehicle and cause the crash deliberately. He stated clearly that Lucas was the one who had rescued Amelia from the water that night, risking his own life without hesitation. Jackson explained that he had buried the truth to protect the company during a period of severe financial crisis, sacrificing an innocent man to save an empire that was never truly his to protect that way. He acknowledged that Lucas had been turned into a scapegoat despite having done absolutely nothing wrong, a burden he had carried alone for 10 silent years. Jackson also revealed that he had quietly gathered evidence against Joseph long before his death, but he had never found the courage to release it while he was still alive. He offered a direct apology to Lucas, acknowledging that his silence had cost the younger man his career, his reputation, and an entire decade of his life. Amelia listened to her father's confession through tears she could no longer hold back, grief and understanding arriving together in the same breath. Joseph attempted to flee the building the moment the recording ended, only to be intercepted by authorities waiting near the parking structure below. The files recovered from the hard drive proved conclusively that he had manipulated the vehicle a decade earlier, sabotaged Apex One recently, embezzled research funding over several years, manipulated company stock prices, and orchestrated an elaborate plan to seize control of the entire corporation. David Mason immediately revoked Joseph's interim authority, and the board voted without hesitation to reinstate Amelia as chief executive. Yet Amelia surprised the room by refusing to accept her position back right away, insisting instead that the company owed the public a complete and unfiltered account of everything that had happened, including her own father's role in causing it. Several board members objected, warning that full disclosure could send the stock price even lower than it had already fallen. Amelia answered that a company saved through lies would always live in fear of the truth eventually catching up with it. She turned to Lucas in front of everyone gathered in that room and confirmed publicly that he was the man who had saved her life, and the engineer her own company had wrongfully blamed for a crime he never committed. When the board offered Lucas a senior executive position as a gesture of reconciliation, he asked Amelia only one question in return. This time he said, "Do you want to fix the company or do you only want to save its name?" 6 months later, Grace Mobility completed an independent investigation into everything the recording had exposed. The company accepted a substantial financial penalty, compensated everyone harmed by the years of concealment, and released the entire buried history to the public without hesitation or delay. Although the company's value dipped sharply in the months that followed, trust slowly returned among employees and customers who had once feared the worst about the organization's leadership. Amelia resumed her role as chief executive only after the board approved a new oversight structure specifically designed to limit unchecked individual power at the top. Lucas was fully and formally cleared of every accusation ever made against him. When Amelia offered him a substantial financial settlement, he declined it, unwilling to treat money as a way of erasing everything the past decade had cost him. Instead, he asked only for a handful of changes that meant far more to him than any check ever could. He wanted his employment record corrected permanently, compensation extended to others who had been silenced over the years, an independent safety division created with real authority to halt any project, and a standing rule that no chief executive would ever again be allowed to ignore an engineer's warning. Lucas agreed to become the company's new director of systems safety, but only under a schedule that still allowed him to fulfill his responsibilities as a father without compromise. His daughter Madison was mentioned only briefly, when Lucas made clear that no title or position would ever turn him into an absent parent again. Amelia respected that boundary completely, choosing not to rush into any part of his personal life before he was ready to share it. On the anniversary of the accident that had changed both their lives forever, Amelia and Lucas returned together to the same lake where everything had first begun. She asked him how, after everything her family had done, he had still found it within himself to save her not once but twice. Lucas answered simply that he had never been trying to save the Grace name, only a person who happened to be drowning, and that 10 years later, he had simply done the very same thing all over again. Amelia admitted quietly that some debts could never truly be repaid with money, no matter how much of it she had. Lucas told her she could repay it instead by making sure no innocent person would ever again be forced into silence the way he had been. Amelia reached for the hand that carried his scar, and this time Lucas did not pull it away. They walked from the water together, no longer a billionaire and her employee, no longer a woman in debt and the stranger who had saved her, but simply two people finally free of a secret that had held them both for 10 long years.